When I saw him standing there under the soft porch light, holding a rolled bandage in one hand and a flashlight in the other, my heart did something strange. Not the kind of flutter you read about in books, more like a collapse, a quiet implosion that said, "This is where it begins." My husband was inside, snoring softly in front of the TV, completely unaware that I had just fallen in front of the neighbor's gate, scrubbing my knees in dignity against the concrete. And now this man, this stranger who had moved in only weeks ago, was offering to help. I didn't say yes. But I didn't say no either. And that silence, I think, spoke louder than anything else I could have said. I remember how his hand brushed against mine as he handed me the cold compress. Not intentionally. Not seductively. Just real. And maybe that's what scared me most. Because it had been so long since I felt something that wasn't rehearsed, expected, safe. 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A quiet, slow, and deliberate mistake that changed everything. I'm not proud of it. But if I'm going to tell you this story, I need to start there, right there, under the porch light, with the sting of gravel in my knees and the weight of a man's gaze I wasn't supposed to crave. But before I begin, tell me, have you ever felt something you couldn't explain, yet knew it would destroy you if you followed it? Let me take you back to where it all began. The house had fallen silent again. That kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's just empty. The dishwasher had finished its last cycle. The TV in the living room was on, but the volume had been turned down to almost nothing. Somewhere down the hallway, my husband was likely half asleep already, buried beneath the same beige comforter we'd used for years. Beige, like the walls, the rugs, the way we touched, if we ever touched at all anymore. I stared at my own reflection in the hallway mirror. My face, my body, my clothes, they all looked familiar, but none of them looked like me. There was a time, maybe 15 years ago, when I would wear red lipstick for no reason, just to feel a little electric. Now I was in gray sweatpants and a loose t-shirt I used to paint the guest room 2 summers ago. I didn't feel ugly. I just felt invisible. The doctor had told me I needed to move more. Get outside, he said. Fresh air, light cardio, strengthen the joints. So I'd ordered rollerblades. Not because I loved the idea. Because it was ridiculous. Because maybe doing something ridiculous would remind me that I was still alive, not just watching myself fade through the glass. That afternoon, I'd waited until my husband left for a work meeting. I dusted off the skates and strapped them on with shaking hands. Our backyard wasn't big, but the concrete path around the garden was just enough. I moved carefully, laughing a little to myself at how absurd I must have looked. A woman my age, skating in the sun like she was 20 again. But I needed it. I needed to feel the breeze on my face. I needed to stumble and wobble and move. And then I fell. It wasn't a graceful fall. My leg buckled, my knee scraped hard against the pavement, and I let out a sound that wasn't quite a cry. The world tilted slightly. I sat there, stunned, more embarrassed than hurt, until I heard a gate creak. He was standing there. The neighbor. I'd only spoken to him once or twice, when he moved in, and when his dog wandered into our yard. He wasn't much younger than me, maybe late 40s. Lean, quiet, the kind of man who always wore a watch and never seemed rushed. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just walked over, crouched down, and said, "You're bleeding." I looked at my knee. He was right. But it wasn't the blood I was worried about. It was the way he looked at me, not shocked, not amused, just present. No one had looked at me like that in a very long time. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a small first aid kit and a flashlight. "Power's been weird on my side," he said, motioning to his house. "I keep this thing nearby just in case." He wrapped my knee without asking permission, like it was natural. Like I was someone worth tending to. And I let him. I should have gone inside after that. I should have thanked him, laughed it off, closed the door behind me. But instead, I lingered. I asked how he was settling in. He said the neighborhood was quiet, a little too quiet, maybe. I told him it hadn't always been. I told him about the barbecue we hosted 5 years ago, about the garden I used to keep before I got tired of fighting the weeds. We stood there talking for almost half an hour. The sun dipped lower. The porch light turned on automatically. And still, I didn't leave. When I finally walked back into the house, my husband was asleep. The TV was still murmuring some news program, casting a pale light across his face. He didn't notice the bandage. He didn't ask what took me so long. He didn't open his eyes. I changed into clean clothes, ignoring the sting in my knee. In the bathroom, I touched my lips in the mirror, not because they were painted or swollen or beautiful, but because they had spoken. They had smiled. They had told a stranger about the flowers I used to grow and the dog I wanted to adopt. The next day, I saw him again. He was fixing something in his yard. I waved. He waved back. That night, I waited longer than usual before turning off the kitchen light. I left the curtain open. It felt like something had opened, and I wasn't sure I knew how to close it again. The days that followed blurred into one another, as they often did. Laundry, grocery lists, dishes, my husband's muttered questions about bills or expired coupons. But something inside me had shifted. I caught myself checking the window. Looking out across the lawn. Listening for footsteps that weren't my husband's. I wish I could say that I didn't know what was happening. That I was caught off guard. But that would be a lie. I knew. And I did nothing to stop it. I didn't want to. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just a woman in a house with beige walls. I was a woman who had fallen on rollerblades, who had laughed and bled and talked to a man who made her feel real. And maybe that was the beginning of everything. Or the end of something I hadn't realized was already over. It didn't happen the next day. Or the day after. I think we both needed space to pretend it had been nothing. A neighborly gesture. A harmless accident. He didn't come by again immediately, and I didn't fall on purpose just to see him again. But I did find myself lingering in places where he might notice me. Watering the garden at dusk, adjusting the mailbox in the early evening. Silly little tasks that suddenly became rituals, each one tethered to the silent hope of seeing him again. My knee had started to heal, though I kept the bandage on longer than necessary. I told myself it was to avoid infection. In truth, I think it reminded me of something real, pain that wasn't numbing or emotional, but immediate and physical. It grounded me, oddly. When I touched it, I remembered the weight of his hand, the calm way he had crouched beside me, the warmth of his voice in the twilight. The weather had shifted that week. The dry heat softened into something cooler, almost melancholic. Our neighborhood turned amber in the late afternoons. Golden leaves floated gently down the sidewalks, and I watched them through the kitchen window, stirring tea I had no intention of drinking. My husband passed behind me once or twice, on his way to another room, another task, another place I didn't follow. We barely spoke. He wasn't cruel or cold, just distant. Functional. We shared logistics, not lives. Schedules. Repairs. He'd ask if I needed something from the store or whether I'd paid the electricity bill. He never asked how I was feeling. He didn't notice when I stopped wearing makeup or when I started wearing it again. It was during one of those silent afternoons that I saw the flashlight blink from his side of the fence. Once. Twice. A pause. Then again. I froze, spoon midair, heart suddenly galloping. It was such a small thing, that flicker of light, but it felt deliberate, like a secret handshake. I turned off the stove, wiped my hands, and walked outside like I was just taking out the trash. He was leaning against the fence when I arrived, casual, as if we'd planned it. "You okay?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded. "Thought I'd check on the knee." "It's better," I replied. "Mostly." We didn't mention that it had been days since we'd last spoken. Didn't acknowledge the strangeness of this moment, standing in the soft light of two porches, speaking in hushed tones as if we were conspiring. In a way, we were. I don't remember what exactly we talked about. Weather. His dog. Something about how this neighborhood felt older than it looked. But the space between us began to shrink, not in steps or movement, but in the way our voices carried. There was a softness to the silence that lingered after each reply, as though neither of us wanted the conversation to end. At some point, I glanced back at my house. The living room lights were off. My husband was probably in bed, or maybe still scrolling through his phone, half watching a game. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was here. And he was here. And we were not supposed to be here together. He said something about how quiet the nights were. I said they hadn't always been. He asked why I stopped gardening, and I told him I got tired of keeping things alive that didn't want to bloom. He didn't answer, but his eyes held mine longer than they should have. A second too long. Just enough. I shifted slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair from my cheek. The breeze picked up, carrying with it a chill I hadn't expected. I crossed my arms, not from cold, but from nerves. "You okay?" he asked again, gentler this time. I nodded. There was a pause. One of those electric pauses that thrum in the air before something irreversible happens. And then, we kissed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even slow. It just was. A moment suspended between what had been and what would never be again. When it ended, we both stood there, slightly breathless, slightly stunned. He looked down, then up again. "I'm sorry," he said, almost inaudibly. "No," I replied, before I could stop myself. "Don't be." We didn't say goodbye. We just separated. I walked back across the yard, heart hammering so hard I thought it might echo. The porch light had turned off automatically. I fumbled with the key, as if unlocking the door was harder now. As if stepping back inside meant crossing into another reality I didn't belong to anymore. Inside, the house was dark. The air still. My husband was asleep on the couch, one arm draped over his chest, mouth slightly open. The TV cast a soft blue light onto the carpet. A commercial played, muted. Something about life insurance or cruises. I stood there and watched him for a long time. He didn't wake up. He didn't stir. I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection. My lips didn't look different. My eyes didn't sparkle. There was no glow, no cinematic after effect. But something had changed. I could feel it. Not in my skin, but in the space just beneath it, like the echo of something I couldn't yet name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with my back to my husband, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. I tried to feel guilty. I really did. But what I felt was more complicated than that. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't lust. It was recognition. I had kissed someone who had seen me. Someone who didn't expect anything, who didn't dismiss me with a nod or half-hearted affection. The next morning, I made breakfast like usual. Toast, eggs, coffee. My husband thanked me, kissed me on the cheek, told me he'd be home late. I nodded, smiled, acted as though nothing had changed. But something had. Something had begun. And deep down, I knew it couldn't be undone. The morning after didn't feel like anything special. The sky was the same pale gray it had been for days. The cereal box sat half empty on the counter, and the coffee brewed with its usual hiss and steam. I moved through the motions of the day like a wind-up doll, measuring, stirring, rinsing, each task a kind of camouflage. I didn't want to think. I just wanted to keep moving. But my mind wouldn't obey. It kept circling back, looping the same set of moments over and over again, the cool night air, the pause in his voice, the press of his lips. The way we didn't speak after. The way we separated without looking back. There hadn't been any declarations or promises, no foolish drama or tears. Just one moment that stood on its own like a suspended breath. He didn't come by that day, and I didn't expect him to. I needed the quiet, even if it buzzed in my ears like static. I folded laundry without music, cleaned drawers that hadn't been touched in months, and reorganized the spice rack as if the order of cumin and paprika might anchor me to reality. I didn't want to feel what I felt. But it lingered, soft and unwelcome, like the smell of someone else's cologne in your sweater. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. My husband was still watching a documentary about something historical, battles or politics, I couldn't tell. I mumbled a tired goodnight, and he nodded, not looking up. In bed, I lay with my back to the empty space beside me, waiting for the room to darken completely. Waiting for stillness. And when it came, it felt too loud. I found myself listening for footsteps. Ridiculous, I know. As if he'd show up at my door unannounced. As if we were teenagers sneaking around our parents. But I couldn't stop the craving, that need to be seen again. The shame of that thought crept up my spine, but I didn't chase it away. Shame, at least, was something. A sign that I hadn't become completely numb. The days passed. He remained distant. Not cold, just absent. I saw him once through the window, walking his dog with the same slow, even steps. He didn't look toward the house. I watched him longer than I should have. Maybe he felt it. Maybe he didn't. But I wasn't sure what I wanted him to do, acknowledge me? Avoid me? Reverse time? I began doubting everything. Not just the kiss, but the way it had made me feel. Was it real, or just a response to loneliness? Had I imagined the weight of meaning behind it? Was he just being kind? Was I reading too much into it because I needed someone to make me feel alive again? I turned inward. I became quieter around the house. More deliberate. My husband asked once if something was wrong. I said no, of course not. He offered to take me out for dinner, something we hadn't done in months. I agreed without hesitation. Maybe I was trying to test myself. Maybe I thought pretending would patch the hole that had formed inside me. The restaurant was the same one we used to go to when we first moved into the neighborhood. A small Italian place with dim lighting and slightly overpriced wine. The hostess recognized us and greeted us warmly. We were seated near the window. The candles flickered between us, but they didn't bridge the space. They just reminded me of how long it had been since we'd looked at each other properly. He talked about work. About a new hire who didn't understand procedures. About a client who made ridiculous demands. I listened, nodded in the right places, sipped my wine. But my mind kept drifting. To the fence. To the flashlight. To the quiet way he had said my name that night. I tried to focus. I really did. I asked questions, laughed at his jokes. Smiled when I didn't feel like it. But something in me had fractured. And no amount of effort could glue it back together. On the way home, we stopped at the gas station. He went inside to grab a drink. I sat in the car and stared at the rearview mirror. Not at the traffic or the lights, but at myself. My eyes looked tired. Older. But there was something else in them now, something harder to define. A flicker. A quiet resistance. That night, I dreamt I was skating again. Not on the path in our backyard, but somewhere endless, an open road that curved into the horizon. I kept falling, over and over, but I didn't stop. I kept getting up. The next morning, I woke early and went outside. The dew clung to the grass, and the air had that thick, earthy smell of early fall. I walked to the side of the yard, near the fence, pretending to inspect the flower bed. My hands touched the dirt, but my eyes searched the other side. And then, I heard the gate. Not mine. His. He stepped out with his dog. For a moment, he didn't see me. Or maybe he did and pretended not to. But when he turned toward me, our eyes met. A long, slow second. Neither of us smiled. I straightened, dusted my hands, and turned to go inside. But before I reached the door, I heard his voice, quiet, even. Morning. I paused, nodded, and said, morning. That was it. No more. No less. But it was enough to twist my insides. Enough to remind me that this story, whatever it was, hadn't ended yet. It was suspended, hovering between chapters, waiting for someone to decide whether to close the book or keep turning the pages. Back inside, I wiped my hands on a towel and stared at the kitchen clock. The day stretched ahead of me like a hallway with no doors. And I wasn't sure which way I was supposed to walk. I thought about texting him. About writing something, anything. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I sat at the table, my tea cooling beside me, and let the silence settle around me again, not empty, this time, but full of questions. Questions I wasn't ready to answer. Questions I might never be. I tried to avoid the window for the rest of the day, but it was harder than I expected. My eyes drifted there without permission, as if the light filtering through the curtains held answers I couldn't stop asking. Every sound from the other side of the fence made me pause. Was it his dog? A gate creaking? His footsteps? And each time it wasn't, I felt both relief and disappointment, a strange cocktail of emotion I wasn't used to swallowing. Inside, the house hummed with its usual dull rhythm. The fridge buzzed softly. A clock ticked in the hallway. I rearranged throw pillows and wiped counters that were already clean. Everything felt too quiet, too balanced, as if the air itself were trying to preserve an illusion I no longer believed in. My husband returned home late, carrying the scent of takeout and office fatigue. He placed the bag on the table, kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, and said something about a delayed report and an annoying coworker. I nodded, offered a half-smile, and warmed plates for dinner. The motions were the same, but the meaning behind them had faded, like letters on an old sign washed too many times by the rain. We sat at the table and ate in near silence. His fork scraped the ceramic plate. My glass clinked lightly as I set it down. We exchanged a few words about the news, the weather, a mutual friend's birthday, things that floated on the surface, never daring to dip below. I realized I could probably confess everything to him in a single breath, and he wouldn't even notice until I said his name. After dinner, I excused myself and went outside with a book I didn't plan to read. The evening was cool, and the wooden steps of the porch creaked beneath me as I sat. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stared at the garden, where dry leaves curled at the edges like forgotten secrets. The wind rustled the branches gently, and in the distance, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking once, then going quiet. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the porch light to flicker on. long enough for the sky to turn the color of bruised fruit. And then, faintly, I heard the gate click. He didn't call out. Didn't step closer. But I felt him there, his presence hovering on the edge of my awareness like a held breath. I didn't move. Neither did he. There was something sacred in that stillness, something that didn't need words to be understood. Eventually, he turned and walked away. I heard the quiet shuffle of his shoes on the gravel and the soft thud of the gate closing behind him. And still, I didn't move. The next morning, I awoke before the alarm. The air in the bedroom was cool, and the world beyond the window was just beginning to lighten. My husband stirred briefly, then rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before getting up. That day, I decided to walk to the small market 3 blocks away instead of driving. I told myself I needed the exercise, but really, I needed the space. My thoughts felt louder indoors, like they echoed off the walls. Outside, at least, I could pretend they were just passing noise. I passed his house on the way. The blinds were drawn. The driveway was empty. I kept my eyes forward. At the store, I wandered longer than necessary. Picked up fruit I didn't need, stared at magazine covers without reading the headlines. Everything around me felt simultaneously vivid and distant, like I was moving through a world not quite built for me. On the walk back, I stopped at the old bench near the playground. It was chipped and weathered, but familiar. I sat there with the grocery bag at my feet, watching as leaves fluttered down like tired confessions. A child laughed in the distance. A woman scolded a dog for running off leash. Life continued, as it always did, indifferent to the earthquakes inside people's hearts. I thought about what I would say to him if I had the courage. Would I apologize? Would I pretend the kiss had meant less than it did? Or would I ask him to tell me that I hadn't imagined the way he looked at me, that it had shaken him, too? But I didn't speak to him that day. Or the next. It was 2 days later, in the early evening, when he knocked. Just once. Gentle. Measured. My husband wasn't home yet. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the porch. I opened the door slowly, and he stood there, hands in the pockets of a worn jacket, expression unreadable. I shouldn't have come, he said, eyes flicking toward the ground. I didn't answer. I stepped aside, just enough to let the door open wider. He didn't move. Not at first. Then he stepped forward, not into the house, but just onto the edge of the porch. I wanted to ask if you were okay, he said. That's all. I'm not sure, I replied honestly. We stood there, framed by the doorway and the twilight, 2 people suspended in something that wasn't love, wasn't friendship, wasn't explainable in polite terms. Just need. Recognition. A fragile awareness that some moments change the shape of a life even if they pass quietly. I think about it, he said after a pause. I do too. We didn't say what it was. We didn't need to. After a moment, he nodded and turned to leave. I didn't stop him. I didn't invite him in. But I didn't close the door right away either. I watched him walk away, his figure slowly dissolving into the evening, and felt something inside me stretch, like a thread pulled taut, waiting to snap. That night, I lay awake again. Not with regret, not with panic, but with a strange clarity. Something had shifted again. Not drastically. Just a degree. But I could feel it. And sometimes, 1 degree is enough to change everything. The days began to blur again, but differently this time. Not from the monotony I'd grown used to, but from the quiet weight of things unsaid. I could feel it in the way I folded towels, in the way I brewed coffee, in the way I caught myself pausing by the window without realizing it. It wasn't longing exactly. Not anymore. It was something else. Something heavier. My husband seemed oblivious, though perhaps that wasn't fair. Maybe he did notice, in his own way. He'd started coming home a bit earlier. He asked if I wanted to watch something together in the evenings. He even suggested taking a weekend trip, just the two of us, like we used to, he'd said, and I'd nodded too quickly, as though that would hide the guilt that surged up like tidewater. But the truth was, I couldn't imagine sitting in a hotel room with him anymore. I couldn't picture holding his hand during a walk or curling into him under some unfamiliar quilt. The intimacy we once had dried up so slowly that we hadn't even noticed. We'd mistaken routine for connection, silence for comfort, distance for peace. It had all happened quietly. That was the part that terrified me most. One morning, I found myself going through old photos, some in frames, some tucked away in boxes I hadn't opened in years. There were pictures from vacations, from birthdays, from anniversaries. I looked younger in them, of course, but not just physically. My eyes held a kind of certainty, a groundedness I no longer recognized. I studied one picture in particular, him holding my hand at the beach, both of us laughing, wind whipping through my hair. I could almost remember the feeling of that day, but it felt like watching someone else's life. I put the box away and sat in the living room for a long time. The quiet pressed in around me. I thought about the man next door. About the way he looked at me when I spoke, how his silence never felt empty. I didn't know what I wanted from him, not in a clear, mapped-out way, but I knew what I felt. And I knew that it was real. That afternoon, I went for a walk. Not a purposeful one. Just the kind where you let your feet decide where to go. I passed houses I'd seen 100 times but never really noticed. Lawns with crooked sprinklers, porches with chipped paint, wind chimes rustling like distant bells. I passed his house, too. There were no lights on, no signs of movement. It made my chest tighten unexpectedly. I kept walking until the street curved and led me to the edge of the neighborhood, where the trees grew thicker and the sidewalk narrowed. I sat on a bench and watched the shadows shift as the sun began to dip. It had been years since I let myself feel this kind of stillness, not the kind born from exhaustion, but the kind that demanded presence. The kind that held you in place and asked, "What are you going to do now?" When I returned home, the sky was streaked with pink and orange, and my husband was in the kitchen. He looked up when I came in and said, "I was starting to wonder where you went." I told him I went for a walk. He nodded and went back to stirring whatever he had on the stove. The exchange was so simple, so expected, that it ached. Dinner was quiet, but he seemed to try. He asked about my day, mentioned that we'd been invited to a neighbor's barbecue next weekend. I nodded along, said maybe. I don't remember tasting the food. My thoughts were elsewhere, always, lately, they were elsewhere. Later that night, I stepped out to take the trash. The air was cooler, and the street was mostly dark except for a few porch lights flickering like tired eyes. As I turned back toward the house, I caught sight of him. He was standing by his front steps, a bag in one hand, his dog at his feet. He looked up and saw me. We didn't wave. We didn't speak. But something passed between us. A recognition. An acknowledgement. It was just a second. But it was enough. Back inside, I closed the door softly and leaned against it. My heart was beating faster than it should have. I wasn't a teenager. This wasn't a secret romance. There was no illusion of innocence to hide behind. And yet, every part of me felt as though I'd crossed into a version of myself I hadn't met in years. The next day, I wrote a note. Not to give him. Not to send. Just to write. It said, "I don't know what this is. I only know that I miss being seen. Not admired. Not flirted with. Just seen. For who I am. For what I'm becoming. And I don't know if I'm allowed to want that anymore. I folded the paper and tucked it into the back of a drawer. That evening, my husband brought home flowers. Tulips. I used to love tulips years ago. I hadn't mentioned them in forever. I thanked him, smiled, placed them in a vase. He looked pleased. Proud, even. He kissed me on the forehead, told me I looked nice today. And for a moment, I almost believed we could be something again. But then, after he went to bed, I found myself standing by the window once more, staring into the dark space between our homes. The silence out there felt different than the silence in here. And I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could live inside a version of myself that no longer fit. When I finally turned away, the room seemed colder than before. I climbed into bed carefully, trying not to wake him. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, counting the slow rhythm of his breathing, steady and unaware. And somewhere between his breath and mine, I whispered to no one, "We kissed." Just those two words. And everything that followed remained locked inside. I began avoiding mirrors. Not deliberately at first, it just happened. I stopped pausing in the hallway to adjust my hair, stopped glancing at my reflection in the microwave door, even avoided the bathroom mirror whenever I could. It wasn't shame. Not exactly. It was more like I didn't recognize the person looking back at me anymore. Her expression had changed. Softer in some places, sharper in others. I couldn't decide if she looked more awake or more exhausted. My days started to stretch. Each morning, I'd go through the same familiar tasks, making the bed, straightening cushions, boiling water for tea, but each movement felt slower, heavier, as though time had thickened. I tried reading again, picking up a novel I had abandoned months earlier, but the words couldn't hold me. My eyes skimmed paragraphs without registering meaning, and I'd find myself staring out the window instead, watching the trees sway as if they carried some message I couldn't quite decipher. The neighbor didn't appear for a while. Or maybe he did, and I just missed him. Either way, there was no communication between us, not a wave, not a flashlight flicker, not even a pause in the fence line tension. And still, I felt him constantly. Not in a fantastical way, but in the same way you can feel weather before it changes, an atmospheric presence, subtle but unmistakable. Then, one evening, I heard a knock at the door. Not loud. Not urgent. Just steady. My husband was upstairs, showering after his run. I wiped my hands on a towel, heart already beating faster, and opened the door just enough to see who it was. It was him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "I know this isn't ideal," he said, his voice low and calm. "But could we talk?" I glanced back over my shoulder instinctively, then stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The porch light bathed us in a yellow glow, soft and uneven. We stood a few feet apart, each waiting for the other to say something first. He spoke before I could. "I haven't seen you around," he said, though we both knew that wasn't true. We had seen each other, even in silence. The space between our houses had become its own kind of conversation. "I've been home," I said. He nodded slowly. "So have I." There was a pause. The air between us seemed denser than the night itself. "I just needed to know," he began, then stopped. "I don't want to cause problems. I haven't been able to stop thinking about the other night." I felt a tightening in my throat. I didn't want this conversation, and yet I needed it in the same way a wound needs air before it can begin to heal. "It wasn't nothing," I said. "But I don't know what it was either." He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw no expectations. No demands. Only clarity. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I just didn't want you to think I disappeared because I regretted it. I nodded, eyes fixed on the wood grain of the porch railing. I didn't think that. Silence fell again, thick and awkward and meaningful. Eventually, he said goodnight and turned to leave. I didn't stop him. But this time, something felt settled. Not resolved, but placed gently on a shelf inside me, still present, still waiting, but not urgent. Later that night, my husband asked me if I'd like to go away for the weekend. We could use it, he said. Sometime, just us. I hesitated, then said yes. We drove to a small lakeside in 2 hours north. The road twisted through forests that hadn't yet shed their autumn leaves, and I watched the colors blur past the window like brushstrokes. At the inn, we were given a room with a view of the water. The bed was too big, the decor too floral, but my husband seemed content. We walked by the lake that evening. The air was brisk, and he reached for my hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I let him. His hand was warm, familiar. I remembered what it used to feel like to be held by him, how his fingers would interlock with mine without hesitation. But now, our hands felt like they belonged to two people remembering how to imitate closeness. That night, lying beside him in the room with the chintz curtains and the faint smell of wood smoke, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a version of myself that had never stepped out onto the porch that night. A version that had never looked too long across the fence. A version that could still believe proximity was the same as intimacy. I couldn't. We returned home Sunday afternoon. The house smelled like itself again, laundry detergent, dust, and a faint trace of lemon from the candles I always forgot to light. My husband unpacked in silence, humming to himself. I watched him from the doorway of our bedroom, wondering how many years we had spent in this quiet choreography, one person folding, the other fading. By Tuesday, the rhythm of our routine had returned. Work calls. Grocery runs. Folding dish towels in thirds. And yet, inside me, something refused to settle. It moved around like an ache that shifted with the weather. Then came the note. It was slipped under the doormat late at night. No name, no signature. Just one sentence, written in clean, small letters. I still think of you. I stood there in the hallway, the note in my hand, my heart pounding with a ferocity that caught me off guard. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I was expected to do. I only knew what I felt. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to my husband breathe, watching the shadows move across the ceiling, feeling the weight of that one sentence settle into my chest like a stone dropped in deep water. By morning, I had made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not even a final one. But a decision nonetheless. I would stop pretending I didn't know who I had become. I would stop apologizing to myself for needing more. And I would stop waiting for permission to feel what I already felt. Even if I didn't yet know what to do with it. I don't remember what I was wearing that night. Not because it didn't matter, but because everything else overshadowed the details. The note stayed in my drawer for days, folded carefully beneath a stack of bills and recipes I hadn't touched in years. I'd read it once more each morning, then slide it back into place, telling myself I didn't need to respond. But every time I passed the kitchen window, I found myself looking toward his house, watching for movement, waiting for something I couldn't name. The silence between us had grown thicker, not colder. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was tension, expectation, a question left suspended in the space between two front doors. I went through my days like someone walking across ice, afraid of the sound it might make beneath my feet. My husband had started sleeping earlier again. He stopped suggesting weekend trips and instead focused more on work, late calls, and spreadsheets he never let me see. It suited us, in a way. We had both retreated into ourselves, orbiting the same rooms without contact. Then the storm came. It had started as a distant rumble in the afternoon. Dark clouds stacked themselves high above the neighborhood, and the wind picked up in fits. By early evening, thunder cracked close enough to rattle the windows. Rain followed shortly after, quick and sharp, then heavy and relentless. The air changed. It always did before a proper storm, gaining that charged, metallic taste like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The power flickered around 8. Just once. Then again. And then it went out completely. I stood in the middle of the kitchen with the refrigerator humming its last breath and the lights snapping off overhead. The house fell into a darkness I hadn't felt in a long time, one that wasn't just visual but emotional. It forced stillness. It invited pause. I fumbled for the flashlight in the junk drawer and lit a few candles, placing them along the counters and dining table. Their flames wavered with every gust of wind that found its way through the cracks in the old windows. I wrapped a sweater around my shoulders and stared out into the yard. The rain had slowed slightly, but the wind hadn't. Trees swayed like dancers losing balance. Leaves flew sideways, sticking to glass and gutters. The neighborhood was a patchwork of flickering lights and complete darkness. And across the fence, in that familiar house, I saw his porch light glow. A backup generator, perhaps. Or maybe just luck. I don't know what pushed me to step outside. I don't think it was reason. I don't think it was rebellion. I think it was inevitability. The rain was cold, but I didn't rush. I crossed the yard slowly, each step wetting my shoes, each gust tugging at my sleeves. When I reached the gate, I hesitated. But only for a second. Then I knocked. Softly. He opened the door almost immediately, like he'd been standing on the other side, waiting. His expression was calm, but his eyes said something else, something closer to recognition, or maybe resignation. "You're soaked," he said, stepping back to let me in. I nodded but didn't speak. My voice felt buried too deep. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The warmth of the room pressed against my skin. The lights were low, but steady. A few candles flickered on a side table, casting shadows that danced across the walls. It felt like entering a different time. I stood there for a long moment, dripping, unsure of what I was doing, or why. Then he handed me a towel, and I accepted it without a word. I dried my face, my arms, my hair. I didn't ask why he hadn't reached out again. He didn't ask why I had come. We sat in silence, side by side on his small couch. The dog curled up at his feet, undisturbed. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Thunder rolled softly in the distance. He poured us both a cup of tea. The mug in my hands was warm, grounding. We didn't speak for a while. The quiet was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes from knowing the conversation is already happening and everything left unsaid. Eventually, I turned to him. His eyes met mine, steady, open. And I said, barely above a whisper, "I don't know what this is." He didn't look away. Neither do I. And that was all. We didn't try to name it. We didn't try to define boundaries or imagine futures. We simply allowed the moment to exist. The hours passed slowly. The storm began to weaken, the rain softened into something gentler. The power didn't come back, but I no longer minded. The candlelight cast everything in amber and shadow, as though time itself had slowed. At some point, I stood up and walked toward the window. The glass was fogged, the street outside shimmering with puddles and reflections. I could see my own house across the yard, dark and quiet. I imagined my husband asleep, unaware. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. I turned back to him. He hadn't moved. Just watched me. And that night, we spent the night together. Not in chaos. Not in passion. Not in defiance. But in stillness. In recognition. In the soft echo of something inevitable. The next morning arrived like a hush. The kind of morning that didn't announce itself with alarm clocks or traffic sounds or birdsong. Just pale light filtering through curtains and the gentle creak of a house settling back into itself. I woke slowly, without panic, without confusion. Only a strange quietness inside me, like I'd been holding my breath for too long and hadn't yet decided whether to exhale. I sat up carefully, not because I was trying to hide but because I didn't want to disturb the weight of the moment. He wasn't in the room. I could hear soft movements somewhere farther in the house, the sound of water running briefly, the faint clink of ceramic against wood. I didn't call out. I just listened. I found my clothes where I'd left them on a chair by the window, slightly damp at the hems from the rain the night before. I dressed in silence, each movement deliberate, my thoughts moving slowly and precisely, like I was stepping over a thin sheet of glass I didn't want to break. When I walked into the kitchen, he was standing by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He looked up, eyes calm, expression unreadable. He didn't smile, and I was grateful for that. This wasn't a moment for easy gestures. I made coffee, he said, voice low, almost careful. Thank you, I replied, taking the cup he offered. We sat across from each other at the table. The light outside was diffused through the rain-washed windows, painting everything in pale gray. For a few minutes, we just drank our coffee. It felt like the most human thing we could do. Neither of us spoke about the night. There was nothing to say. Not because it didn't matter, but because it did, so much so that speaking about it felt insufficient. Language would only flatten something that had been too full, too alive. I should go, I said finally, setting my mug down. He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. You'll be okay, he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. I don't know. There was no goodbye, no embrace, no lingering touch. I stepped outside, into the light drizzle, and made my way across the yard. The world was still damp, but the rain had softened into a kind of mist that clung gently to my skin. The porch steps creaked under my feet. When I opened the front door, the house was still. My husband hadn't woken yet. I closed the door behind me and stood there, letting the quiet wrap around me like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The smell of the house was the same, warm and faintly sweet from the candles I'd lit days before. But everything felt different now, though nothing visible had changed. Upstairs, I moved through the motions. Changed clothes. Brushed my hair. Washed my face. My reflection in the mirror was neutral. Not glowing, not ruined. Just altered. Something about the way I held myself had shifted. I stood straighter. But there was also a shadow beneath my eyes that hadn't been there before. My husband eventually came downstairs, yawning, already dressed for work. He asked if the storm had kept me up. I told him yes. He kissed my cheek, thanked me for making coffee, and left with his briefcase swinging from his hand like it always did. And then I was alone. Truly alone. 4 hours. I thought I would feel consumed with guilt. I thought the weight of the previous night would press down like a landslide, crushing every part of my routine. But instead, there was a strange stillness. Not peace. Just stillness. I cleaned. Slowly. Methodically. Wiped counters that didn't need wiping. Rearranged the spice rack again. Swept the kitchen floor even though I had done it the day before. I needed my hands to move, because my mind couldn't. By the time noon came, I sat down at the table and stared out the window, across the fence, but I didn't expect to see him. I didn't know what I would have done if I had. I just looked. A few hours later, I received a message from my husband. I might be home late, meeting ran over. Don't wait for me to eat. I stared at the screen for a moment, unsure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. I turned the phone face down on the table. That evening, I took a long walk. Not toward the store or the park or the bench I usually ended up at. I walked without destination, letting my feet choose streets I didn't know well. Every passing house became a blur of curtains and porch lights, of families I didn't know and couples I would never meet. I thought of the life I had built, of all the years I had spent folding myself smaller to make room for someone else's silence. When I returned home, it was dark. The kitchen smelled faintly of detergent. I reheated soup, not because I was hungry but because it seemed easier than skipping dinner entirely. I sat alone and ate 3 spoonfuls, then pushed the bowl away. Upstairs, I opened the drawer and pulled out the note. I still think of you. It hadn't been signed. It hadn't needed to be. I turned it over. Blank. And yet, the absence of words said more than I was ready to admit. I didn't cry. I didn't fall apart. But I didn't feel whole either. I folded the note again and placed it between the pages of a book I hadn't read in years. I stood at the window for a long time before going to bed. I watched the streetlights shimmer in puddles, listened to the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, and thought about the quiet that comes after something irreversible. It doesn't roar. It doesn't scream. It just settles into the walls like a new layer of paint you never asked for. When I lay down, the sheets felt cold, even though the room was warm. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep. But instead of dreams, only one thought repeated in my mind, over and over, like a breath I couldn't release. Nothing will ever be quite the same again. The air inside the house began to feel heavier, not with heat or moisture but with everything that hadn't been said. The days after that morning slipped by without punctuation, without clear beginnings or ends. Time stretched into itself. I moved through it like someone living under a low ceiling, careful not to stand too tall or speak too loudly. I wasn't hiding, not exactly. I was waiting, though I wasn't sure for what. My husband returned to his usual rhythm. He left early, returned late, kissed my forehead out of habit, and asked the same surface-level questions that could have applied to any version of me, from any year. Did you eat today? Anything new in the mail? Have you seen my blue shirt? He didn't know. I could feel it in the way he looked at me. Not suspicion, not even confusion, just absence. He hadn't noticed that I was watching him differently. That I was watching everything differently. He didn't ask about the quiet between us, and I didn't offer anything that might break it. And maybe that was what unsettled me most, the realization that I could be completely changed, and still go unnoticed. One morning, while folding laundry, I found one of his old sweaters in the back of the drawer. It was soft from too many washes, its cuffs frayed, a small tear near the hem. I held it for a while, unsure why. It smelled faintly of him, of the soap he'd used for years and the faint trace of old aftershave. I pressed the fabric to my face and waited for a feeling I couldn't name to come. But nothing did. I placed the sweater back and moved on to towels. Later that week, I received a text message from him. Not my husband, *him star. The neighbor. It was short. I'm sorry I haven't spoken. I thought it might be easier that way. I didn't reply immediately. I stared at the words, rereading them with a quiet sense of pressure growing in my chest. Easier for whom? I wondered. For me? For him? For both of us? I waited several hours before writing back. I'm not sure easier is what I want. I didn't send it right away. I typed it, then deleted it. Rewrote it. Then changed it to something else. In the end, I wrote, I've been thinking, too. I hit send before I could overanalyze it. Before I could decide whether it was brave or foolish. He didn't answer that day. Or the next. But 2 days later, a small envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name written in clean handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, only a few lines. I know this will end, probably sooner than we think. But what I felt with you wasn't pretend. And I hope that matters, even if it doesn't last. I read it 3 times before folding it and placing it in the same book that held the other note. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. But for the first time in days, I felt something settle inside me, like a puzzle piece finding its edge. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The sky was still dark, but the air felt cooler. I dressed quickly and left the house without waking my husband. I walked without a destination again, passing houses slowly, noticing things I'd never cared to see before, cracks in driveways, broken shutters, the way one neighbor painted only the front of their fence. I thought of how much of my life had been lived facing forward, performing the role of who I thought I was supposed to be. Wife. Homemaker. Neighbor. Quiet supporter. I had built a home around those roles, arranged every piece of myself to fit them neatly. And yet, somewhere along the way, I'd become unrecognizable to myself. Back home, my husband greeted me with coffee already made. He said he'd taken the day off. Thought we could do something together, he said, casually, like it was spontaneous. But I knew better. He had noticed something. Not everything. But something. I nodded and asked what he had in mind. He shrugged. Maybe a drive. Or we could have lunch by the lake. Just talk. We ended up driving to the water, where the wind tugged gently at our clothes and the sky hung low with a soft haze. We sat on a bench overlooking the lake, watching a few ducks drift aimlessly across its surface. He talked more than usual, about work, about retirement, about fixing the garage. I listened, answering when I could, smiling where I should. But the truth sat inside me like a rock. At one point, he turned to me and said, I feel like we've both been elsewhere lately. I looked at him, unsure how much to say. He continued, I know I haven't been easy to be around. For a long time. And I think maybe I just started assuming you'd always be there, even if I wasn't. I swallowed hard but said nothing. I want to try again, he added. If you do. I nodded, slowly. But it wasn't an agreement. It was a gesture. A kindness. I didn't have the words for what I felt. Not yet. That night, he cooked dinner for the first time in months. He played music while chopping vegetables and poured wine without asking. He made an effort. I saw it. I respected it. But I also saw that it might be too late. Not because I didn't care, but because something had shifted in me that couldn't be shifted back. After dinner, while he was upstairs, I stepped outside for air. The sky was nearly black, stars swallowed by a thin veil of clouds. I looked toward his house. One light was on in the living room. I didn't move toward it. I didn't expect anything. But just before I turned to go back inside, I saw movement through the window, a silhouette, pausing, then stepping away. And for a moment, I imagined we were still standing on opposite sides of the fence. Both of us holding our breath, waiting to see who would speak first. The morning after felt like the last page of a book I hadn't realized I was writing. Everything in the house looked the same, the crooked lamp in the corner, the faint coffee stain on the rug, the chipped edge of the hallway mirror, but I felt unanchored, like someone who had just stepped off a train and couldn't quite remember where she was supposed to go. My husband moved through the kitchen in silence, sipping his coffee, scrolling through his phone. He looked up once and smiled at me, not a performative smile, but something quieter, hopeful, maybe. I returned it with effort. The kind of smile you give when you're trying to hold a door open with your shoulder while your hands are already full. I thought I would feel lighter after the conversation by the lake. But I didn't. I felt aware. Aware of how long we'd both been drifting. Aware of how hard he was trying now. Aware of how much I wanted to meet him halfway and how deeply I knew I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want to be fixed. I didn't want to return to the version of myself that once settled so easily into the background of this house. I didn't want to pretend that kindness was enough, or that shared history guaranteed connection. I wanted to be seen. Not remembered. Not appreciated. Just seen. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the neighborhood. It was warm for the season. The breeze moved slowly through the trees, rustling leaves still clinging to branches with surprising stubbornness. I sat on the bench near the playground, the one I'd stopped at weeks before, and stared at the sidewalk. Children played nearby. Their laughter rose and fell like music, bright and free. It made me ache. I thought about how many years I had spent arranging myself around other people's needs. How much of my identity had been built through service, quiet, careful, reliable. I had been the kind of woman who made sure everything ran smoothly. Who picked up the dry cleaning, who remembered birthdays, who refilled the sugar jar without anyone asking. And then one day, I had started waking up to a version of myself that didn't want to be invisible anymore. When I returned home, the house was empty. My husband had gone to the store. I found a note on the counter, his handwriting uneven, rushed. Back soon. Let's have dinner outside. I placed it back without comment and walked upstairs. My reflection in the mirror was no longer unfamiliar, but it wasn't settled either. I had become a version of myself I was still learning to live inside. Not younger. Not freer. Just more honest. I went to the bookshelf and pulled down the novel where I had hidden the notes. They slid out easily, folded and worn from being read too many times. I held them in my hands for a moment, then unfolded the second one. I know this will end, probably sooner than we think. But what I felt with you wasn't pretend. I read it again, slowly. Then I folded it once more and placed it in my jacket pocket. That evening, my husband grilled vegetables on the patio. He lit the candles I usually had to remind him about. He poured wine into the nicer glasses, the ones we had received as a wedding gift and almost never used. We ate in relative silence, punctuated by small talk. He asked about a neighbor's dog. I told him it had stopped barking at night. He nodded. After dinner, we sat quietly under the string lights he had put up years ago and never taken down. They flickered gently in the breeze, casting soft, uneven shadows across the table. I watched the flames of the candles flutter. He reached for my hand. "I'm trying," he said. "I really am." I didn't pull away. But I didn't squeeze back. "I know," I said softly. The moment passed like fog dissipating at sunrises there, and then not. Later that night, when he had fallen asleep with the television humming low in the background, I stood at the window. The other house was dark. No lights in the front. No sound. Just the quiet outline of something I couldn't step toward anymore. But I needed closure. So the next morning, I wrote him a note. It was short, but not careless. "I don't regret it. But I can't keep looking across that fence hoping you'll be there. I need to look inward now. I hope you understand." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. I walked it across the yard just after sunrise, when the dew still clung to the grass and the sky was the color of ash. I placed the note at his door, tucked just beneath the mat, then walked away without looking back. That afternoon, I took off my wedding ring. Not because I had made a decision, but because I needed to feel my hand without it. I placed it in the drawer beside my bed, next to a pair of earrings I hadn't worn in years. In the days that followed, my husband and I moved carefully around each other. He noticed the absence of the ring but said nothing. I noticed the absence of his questions, and I didn't fill the silence with answers. We were two people living in a shared memory of something that had once worked, both waiting to see if anything new could be built from what remained. Weeks later, I saw the neighbor again. It was brief, just a moment at the mailbox. We nodded. Nothing more. But in that glance, there was no anger. No guilt. Just a quiet acknowledgement that we had once stood in the same storm and made it through. And maybe that was all it was ever meant to be. Not a love story. Not a betrayal. Just two lives brushing for a moment and showing one another the part of themselves they had forgotten existed. Now, when I stand by the window, I don't look across the yard. I look at the sky. At the trees. At the path ahead.